I'll be speaking to Gilbert Ashkar. He's a professor at SOAS, the University of London. He's the author of many books, and he has a new one forthcoming. It's called The New Cold War, Chronicle of a Confrontation Foretold. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Stanley. Hi.
On the site of New Politics, you've written an important article that was headlined, "A Memorandum on the Radical Anti-Imperialist Position Regarding the War in Ukraine." You start by saying, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the second defining moment of the new Cold War. Could you explain?
Well, precisely. I mean, this is to be explained in relation with the book that whose title you just quoted. I had published in the year 2000 a book in French titled The New Cold War. And probably that was the first book ever to hold this idea of a new Cold War in the title, about what was going on after the end of the Soviet Union. And my point was that during the 90s, there were a number of decisions taken by Washington in particular. Most importantly, the decision to enlarge, not only to maintain NATO, but to enlarge NATO, whereas the expectation would have been on the Russian side that since there was no longer a Soviet Union, there was no longer the so-called communist threat, there was no longer the Warsaw Pact, which was the Eastern Bloc's response to NATO. All this had disappeared by the end of 91. And yet the Washington, instead of dissolving NATO, whose purpose had ceased to exist, it was originally to conceived as a defensive alliance, or so-called defensive alliance against what was perceived as the communist threat represented by the Soviet Union. So since this had vanished, there was no purpose in maintaining NATO, except that Washington not only decided to maintain NATO, but to enlarge NATO and bring into NATO countries that were in the previous Warsaw Pact, or even, which is even worse from the Russian point of view, countries that were part of the Soviet Union itself, that is former Soviet republics, like the three Baltic republics of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. And then later on, you had the offer or the promise made to Georgia and Ukraine, to also former Soviet republics, to integrate them in NATO. So these decisions, this behavior, and including the uses of NATO up to the Kosovo War in 1999, is what made me write that book at that time, explaining that the world had stumbled into a new Cold War by the fault of Washington. And indeed, all developments since then have basically confirmed what I saw at that time, in the sense that we have really had, since the beginning of this century, a Cold War, a new Cold War going on. What is a Cold War? A Cold War is not an ideological clash, because then why call it cold? It doesn't make sense. Cold War is about the arms race. Is about maintaining a level of military expenditure suitable for a war, without a war. That's why it remains cold. It gets hot if the country gets involved in a war. And that's what happened, because the countries went into arms race. We've seen Washington maintaining Cold War levels of military expenditure, which now have even reached a peak under Joe Biden. We've seen Moscow doing its best to catch up, although it's dwarfed from the point of view of economic possibilities by comparison with the United States, and China, of course, which is my point was that was a triangular Cold War.
Right, but you say this attack on Ukraine is the second defining moment. What's the
Well,
first?
I needed to explain. I was to explain what the new Cold War means. So within that framework, we've had two defining moments. The first being the invasion of Iraq by the Bush administration in 2003. That was the moment of the peak of hubris of the United States, and represented by George W. Bush administration, which went even further into, through Afghanistan, into even getting financial, military facilities in Central Asian countries and the rest. So you had a major enlargement of the network, the imperial network of the United States. But the war in Iraq was the decisive moment in that regard, because contrary to Afghanistan, Washington really wanted to occupy the country and deployed troops in numbers believed to be enough for that purpose. And as you know, it ended in failure, the second major failure after Vietnam for the US empire. And that failure led to a renewed strong constraint on the United States in its military interventions. We've seen how the United States even withdrew from Afghanistan recently. And Washington is more and more resorting to drones and such distance strike gadgets, lethal murderous gadgets, rather than deploying troops, because
so that was the first defining moment, and this is the second.
The second is now, and this time it's the Russian Empire. It's not the US Empire, it's the Russian Empire. And the Russian Empire, by launching this invasion, actually has paradoxically, it was an unintended consequence for sure, that it has strengthened the other side. It has strengthened NATO. It has strengthened the cohesion of NATO, which was in very bad shape for several years, including, of course, mainly the Trump years. And it has now led to Germany deciding to increase substantially its military expenditure. So you have a number of things. The problem is, if this goes on, and if it is successful, then this whole climate, this whole atmosphere of Cold War will become much more tense, and we'll see more and more such incursions and invasions.
And you think it's important
if it fails, that will be a very strong deterrent. Added to the Iraq defeat of the United States, you would have a Ukraine defeat of Russia, and this would act as a strong deterrent against all imperial expeditions of that kind.
Okay. Now, among the points you make with the invasion, some are calling, let's have a ceasefire, but you say that's not good enough.
I mean, when you have one army invading another territory, you can, calling for a ceasefire is okay for the United Nations, because then after the ceasefire, they organize negotiations and the rest. But for us, from the point of view of right, our call should be for the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of the invader troops from the territory invaded.
And you say that Putin should be required to bring everyone home from all the areas they occupied, the ones in the east, and the Donbass and Crimea. Is that right?
Well, I think that we cannot support the law of might, which is the pure law of the jungle. So if you have the strength, Russia is much stronger than these countries, so it does whatever it wants. The United States does the same with other countries in the world. We refuse that. We reject that. So no one can dispute the fact that you have, let's say, a problem with Crimea or even some parts of Eastern Ukraine. But the only way to solve this democratically is by the free exercise of these populations of the right to self-determination. So in the same text that you mentioned, I defend that right of self-determination. That applies to the Crimean or to whichever part of Eastern Ukraine. If you have majorities who want to secede from the country to which they have been belonging until then and join Russia or whatever, that's their right. But this should be done democratically, not by Russian invasion, and not also by rejection by the Ukrainian government or any other of such rights. These rights should be respected, but this should be a democratic operation, if needed with international organization under UN auspices or whatever, but not by force.
Another aspect or another item that you talk about in the article is the concept of a no-fly zone over Ukraine. I was at a rally of mostly Ukrainians in Hartford, and that was a rather popular demand. How do you feel about that, the no-fly zone?
I mean, I can understand Ukrainians, especially those who are under the bombs, much more than those who are abroad or in the United States. I understand those who are under the bombs if they ask for such measures, but it's obviously completely irresponsible. We're speaking, I mean, if you say no-fly zone, the only way for Western countries or NATO or the United States to try to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine would be to clash with the Russian Air Force. And you can imagine what that means. That means World War III. And with a Russia that has already, in a very irresponsible manner, declared the nuclear alert, as has happened 2 days ago, this is really not only playing with fire, but playing with a very big fire. I mean, the future of humanity would be at stake here, the survival of humanity. So that doesn't make sense. These such demands are not serious. Anyway, I'm not seeing. I don't think there is any possibility, and not the slightest possibility, that the United States or NATO country would take such a measure. Not against Russia. They can do that against I don't know, the Libyan Air Force or such countries, or the Iraqi Air Force in Kurdistan, but definitely they won't try it with Russia.
On the other hand, you do support the right of Ukraine to get weapons from US, NATO, etc.
Look, when a weaker country is invaded by a much powerful one, it is normal to support the delivery of weapons to those fighting, resisting the subjugation of their country. Take an example. During the Vietnam War, we were not asking Moscow and Beijing to intervene militarily against American troops, because, like for the no-fly zone, that would have meant a world war, right? But we were definitely 100%, 1000% in favor of delivery of weapons to the Vietnamese resistance. And I would say that it's normal for when there is, I mean, when people are fighting a just war for the liberation or against the invasion of their country, it's normal to that they get what they need to fight. Defensive weapons, of course, it's a matter of getting the defensive weapons they need. This is a much more rational and, I would say, legitimate demand or request than a no-fly zone, which doesn't make sense.
Well, what would you say to those who say, you're saying this is like 1967, comparing it to Vietnam, but really we should be comparing this to 1914, with all sides being wrong, the entire war being useless and horrible, and that that the left should take the position of what was it, defeatism, I think.
Yeah, Well, I think that's a wrong interpretation of the position in 1914. The position was about the war between imperialist states, not the war between one imperialist state and a non-imperialist state, weaker, which becomes an oppressed state. So when you have a clash between Germany and Russia, as you had in 1914, or Germany and France, you may say, I'm fully against this war on both sides, okay? No to the war. And even if you take it to a radical extreme, I don't mind if my country is defeated, right? Now, you can't apply this reasoning on a weaker country, which is not an imperialist country, which is not invading any other country, with being invaded by a major imperial force. Then you have that becomes a war that becomes a national liberation war, like we have had against colonialism, against imperialism, and the rest. The same Bolsheviks, for instance, who had adopted this revolutionary defeatism attitude. Only the Bolsheviks, actually. There were other internationalists with much general anti-war, pro-peace positions. But even the Bolsheviks, they would never have asked one of the oppressed nations of the Russian Empire to lay down their arms in the face of the Russian imperialist forces if they were confronting them. That is a completely different story.
Now, one of the charges that Putin makes is that Ukraine is a Nazi state, which is absurd. But in truth, there is an autonomous unit in the Ukrainian National Guard that was called the Azov Battalion, which is rife with symbols of fascism and anti-Semitism. In the past, parts of the left have called for the dissolution of that unit. It hasn't happened. Does this discredit the Ukrainian resistance?
Well, on this, two things. First, Russia and Vladimir Putin are the very last persons who can claim to fight Nazism or denazify any other country. Because if any country is closer to the Nazi model, it's between the two, between Ukraine and Russia, it's definitely much more Russia. Vladimir Putin with his completely autocratic regime, his fascistic ideology inspired by fascistic ideologues of the concept of Eurasia and the rest. His speeches in which he attacks, he criticizes harshly the Bolsheviks for having weakened Russia with their internationalism and their respect for the right to self-determination. All this, he's showing his nature every day as a far-right, authoritarian, repressive government, which is which is admired by the global far right, including in the United States, as you know very well, how much Trump and Fox News, what's his name, this guy, and forgot the name.
Tucker Carlson, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. And the rest, these people, and Steve Bannon, by the way, they are all praising, how
right.
smart
we know that's
and great Putin is. Yeah. So that's one point. The second point is, yes, there is this Azov brigade, which the Ukrainians integrated in the army. It's a small unit in their army. It's not that okay, but I mean, for Putin to speak of Nazifying a country whose president is a Jewish person whose family perished in the Holocaust, and who was elected by a landslide against the incumbent, so it's a very democratic election. To call that Nazism is grotesque. And if you look at the far right, the Ukrainian far right, they have only one MP in parliament, 1 MP out of 450. That's a much lesser proportion than the far right in the US Congress, isn't it? And at the last presidential elections, they got 1.5% of the votes, which is, negligible. So this exists. That's very bad. And I'm not saying that anyhow the Ukrainian government is not a government that I would support without a war. I mean, if I were in Ukrainian politics, I would be fighting for left-wing causes, not for this government, which is not left-wing government. No one is claiming that this is a left-wing government, but neither it is a Nazi government, which is.
And for the left, we can't hide. We shouldn't hide the fact that this Azov Battalion exists.
Yeah,
we have to be honest.
Of course, I have absolutely no problem denouncing this and demanding its dissolution. Of course, I mean that's not a problem. But this doesn't. It's not of a size that would determine our position on what's happening. Especially that the other side, it's not an Azov that they have. The whole army and the whole Putin system is exactly in the same mindset, far right mindset, very clearly and obviously.
I know you're at have a time limit here, so I have just 2 more questions. You've written on the question of sanctions against Russia, it should depend on what kind of sanctions are being considered. Could you elaborate?
No, it's just that, first of all, there are demands in the Ukrainian movement and the rest for sanctions. Now, I don't think that we as progressives should support the demand for sanctions at a time when Western governments are in no need for much pressure on that. They are implementing sanctions. So that's one point. Second point, I don't have any trust in their implementation of sanctions in the sense that they have, like, I mean, in several instances, like Cuba or Iraq or the rest, they have used the sanctions as mechanisms to force other peoples or other countries in a very imperialistic manner. So that's why I said that, I mean, I think that the progressive should neither support these sanctions nor demand that they are lifted as long as the war is going on, because they may curtail the possibility of Russia to carry on or expand its invasion. But that's it. So at this point, that would be my position towards this issue. The position I believe that progressives should adopt on this issue.
The last question has to do with the thousands of Russians who have spontaneously acted against the invasion and have come out into the streets, even at risk of arrest. Isn't this, I mean, to me, it's so encouraging and so crucial, because Putin is going to have to be pushed out or influenced by these people.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I talked to a Russian friend who's based in Moscow and also went to St. Petersburg, and he told me that I mean, more than at any point before, there's a very strong popular rejection of the war, and even though the numbers who may flow into the streets are not comparable to what you had in Berlin a couple of days ago in the anti-war demonstration there, because of the very harsh repression, there are now several thousand people arrested. So anyone in the United States who believes that Russia is something, the Russian regime is something they would want, just imagine you had several thousand arrests every time you have an anti-war demonstration in the United States, right? I mean, even at the time of Vietnam, it never happened at this scale. So, so yes, that's very encouraging. I think that Vladimir Putin went a big step too far in the invasion of Ukraine. I think that he miscalculated completely, and he has been so much isolated with his paranoid fear of COVID and the rest over the last couple of years, that he has probably he has convinced himself, if you want, that through self-delusion, that the Ukrainian people will welcome the Russian troops, with in their majority, in their majority with flowers, and that was completely crazy. Exactly the same madness, or even worse than that of the George W. Bush team when invading Iraq, and this is such a huge issue that it might eventually lead to his own downfall. I don't exclude that. If there are any people, any rational people around him, seeing how, the huge problem he has created by his behavior, they may be tempted, if they manage, if they can, to get rid of him. But anyhow, that's I would rather want to see the popular movement rise and overthrow this oppressive autocratic regime.
Well, thank you so much for this interview. And we're going to link to your article on the New Politics site underneath the YouTube. Have a great day.
Thank you, Stanley. You too. All the best.